The twisted legacy of the Bramwells. There are certain family photographs that should never exist. In a dusty attic in rural Kentucky, hidden behind generations of forgotten mementos, rests a wedding album telling a tale so fundamentally wrong, so twisted, that even hardened historians have struggled to speak its name aloud. The bride is radiant, dressed in white lace, her smile hopeful and innocent. Beside her, the groom stands proud, his hand placed possessively on her waist. They appear to be any young couple starting their life in 1920s America. However, this photograph conceals a secret that would shatter everything we believe about the limits of human decency. She didn't merely marry into the family, she married her own blood, her own brother. And this wasn't an act born of madness or desperation stemming from isolation. This was calculated. This was planned. This was a family tradition that had been festering in the shadows of American society for generations, concealed behind Christian values and respectable facades, while something unspeakably dark grew stronger with every passing year. Tonight, we will reveal the story of the Bramwell family of eastern Kentucky. This is a bloodline so corrupted by its own design that, by the time the truth finally surfaced, it was already too late for the children who paid the ultimate price. This is more than just a story of rural isolation or forbidden love. It's about a family that deliberately chose to destroy itself from within, generation after generation, and the innocent victims who never had a chance to escape the genetic prison their ancestors had constructed around them. The woman in that wedding photograph was Sarah Mae Bramwell. The man standing next to her was her brother Thomas. And what unfolded after their wedding night would forge a legacy of human suffering that continues to haunt the Kentucky hills to this day. The seed of the curse. The Bramwell curse didn't start with Thomas and Sarah Mae. It began 3 generations earlier in 1847, when Jeremiah Bramwell first settled in the remote hollers of Pike County, Kentucky. Jeremiah wasn't seeking fortune in the coal mines or running from the law. He was running from something far more shameful, far more personal. Court records from his previous home in Virginia narrate a different story than the one his descendants would later claim. Jeremiah had been quietly asked to leave his community after allegations surfaced concerning his relationship with his own sister, Rebecca. But here in the mountains, where neighbors lived miles apart and questions were not asked, Jeremiah could start fresh. He could reinvent himself. Most significantly, he could begin building a family according to his own twisted vision of purity. Jeremiah preached that true strength came from keeping the bloodline concentrated, believing that outside blood weakened the family line. He argued for an undiluted heritage, free from strangers who couldn't understand their ways. This sounds like the rambling of a madman, but Jeremiah was calculating, he was planning something that would span generations. Jeremiah's first move wasn't to find a local wife. It was to send word back to Virginia, calling for his younger sister, Rebecca, to join him. She arrived 6 months later, already carrying his child. The local preacher who married them never inquired about their identical features or their shared last name. Money changed hands. Documents were altered, and in the church records, Rebecca Bramwell became Rebecca Matthews. But within the privacy of their isolated cabin, she remained precisely what she had always been, Jeremiah's sister, his wife, and the unwilling mother of a bloodline that would carry poison in its veins for the next century. The experiment begins. Their first child, a son they named Ezekiel, was born in 1848. He appeared healthy at birth, but by age 3, the signs were already visible. Ezekiel couldn't speak properly, his left arm was withered, and his eyes held a vacant stare that unsettled even his own parents. Yet, Jeremiah saw no warning in his son's condition. He saw only the genesis of his grand experiment in human breeding. Ezekiel Bramwell grew up believing his family was blessed, chosen by God to remain pure in an impure world. When he reached manhood in 1870, there was never any doubt about who his wife would be, his younger sister. Charity had been promised to him since childhood. Not love, but duty, tradition, and the suffocating weight of their father's obsession with bloodline purity bound them together. The wedding was a small event, attended only by immediate family and a few neighbors who had learned not to ask uncomfortable questions about the Bramwells. But behind the carefully constructed facade of respectability and the celebration, something horrifying was already forming. Charity was pregnant before the wedding, and everyone knew it. What they did not know was that this pregnancy would yield not one child, but 3 triplets whose birth would reveal the full horror of the Bramwell bloodline's decline. The first triplet, a boy named Samuel, seemed normal at birth but never developed the ability to walk. His legs remained useless and twisted, forcing him to crawl like an animal across the cabin floor. The second, a girl named Ruth, was born with her heart on the wrong side of her chest, a condition that would claim her life before her 5th birthday. However, it was the third child, a boy named Morai, who would truly inherit his grandfather's terrible legacy. Morai was born with a sharp intelligence that seemed almost unnatural, as if the genetic damage that had ruined his siblings had somehow concentrated their mental capacity into his developing brain. By age 3 he could read, by age 5 he could perform complex mathematical calculations, and by age 10, he was already developing his own theories about what he termed genetic perfection through selective breeding. He had transformed his grandfather's crude obsessions into something that resembled science, something that sounded almost reasonable when delivered in his calm, measured voice. But beneath Morai's intellectual gifts lurked something much darker. He had inherited more than just his grandfather's beliefs about bloodline purity. He had inherited the family's complete inability to see their own victims as human beings worthy of choice or compassion. The patriarch's twisted science. By 1895, Morai Bramwell had become the family's undisputed patriarch, ruling his bloodline like a twisted scientist conducting an experiment on human genetics. As tradition demanded, he had married his own sister. But Morai's ambitions extended far beyond simple sibling marriage. He began meticulously keeping detailed records of every death, every birth, and every genetic anomaly that surfaced in the family tree. He catalogued the children who died in infancy, those who survived with severe disabilities, and the rare few who seemed to inherit what he called concentrated family gifts. Morai's wife and sister, Temperance, bore him 7 children over 12 years. 3 died before their first birthday, their tiny bodies unable to cope with the genetic damage running through their blood. 2 more survived, but lived their entire lives as invalids, entirely dependent on family members who viewed them not as beloved children, but as failed experiments. However, it was the surviving children, Sarah Mae and Thomas, who would become the culmination of Morai's life work. Thomas, born in 1896, was physically strong but emotionally hollow, as if the genetic concentration had burned away his capacity for normal human feeling. Sarah Mae followed 2 years later, beautiful in an ethereal way that seemed to charm everyone who met her. But beneath her appearance lay a mind that had never been allowed to develop its own thoughts, its own desires, or its own sense of self-preservation. From birth, she had been told her purpose was to marry Thomas, bear his children, and continue the family's advance toward what Morai called genetic transcendence. But Morai was not satisfied with merely arranging another sibling marriage. He had spent decades studying the family's breeding patterns and believed he had discovered something extraordinary. The children born from the most closely related parents, the ones who survived the genetic lottery, appeared to possess unusual abilities. Some showed extraordinary memory, while others demonstrated an almost supernatural capacity to predict animal behavior or weather patterns. Morai convinced himself that his family was evolving into something beyond ordinary humanity, and Sarah Mae and Thomas represented the next crucial step in that evolution. What Morai refused to acknowledge, what he couldn't allow himself to see, was the human cost of his experiment. For every child with unusual gifts, 10 others had died in agony. For every generation that seemed to validate his theories, dozens of lives had been sacrificed on the altar of his scientific hubris. The dark culmination. The spring of 1921 brought unseasonable warmth to the Kentucky mountains, and with it came the wedding that would represent the dark culmination of 74 years of deliberate genetic destruction. Sarah Mae Bramwell had turned 23 that March, and her brother Thomas was 25. They had never known a world where they were not meant for each other, never experienced the freedom to love someone outside their own blood, never even imagined that what their family demanded was profoundly wrong. Sarah Mae spent her wedding morning in the same bedroom where she had slept as a child, her hair arranged by female cousins who whispered excitedly about the ceremony as if it were completely normal. She wore her grandmother Temperance's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and carried a bouquet of mountain laurel, picked from the same hillside where 3 generations of Bramwell brides had gathered their wedding flowers. To an outside observer, she looked like any nervous bride preparing for the most important day of her life. But there were no outsiders watching. The wedding guest list included only immediate family members, and even they numbered fewer than 20 people. Too many children had died young. Too many adults had lived abbreviated lives marred by disability and illness. The Bramwell bloodline was collapsing under the sheer weight of its own genetic damage. Yet, Morai saw only the impending fulfillment of his life's work. Thomas waited at the makeshift altar in the family's main room, wearing a suit that had belonged to his father. His hands were steady, but his eyes were empty of any emotion that could be called love or joy. He understood his role in the family's grand design, having been prepared for this moment since childhood, but during those years of preparation, something essential had been carved out of his soul. He looked at Sarah Mae not as a desired bride or a beloved sister, but as a carefully selected breeding partner in an ongoing experiment. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Could you have broken the cycle, or would the weight of generations have crushed your resistance, too? The ceremony itself lasted less than 10 minutes. A local preacher, generously paid for his silence, spoke the traditional words while carefully avoiding any mention of the groom and bride's relationship. Documents were signed, photographs were taken, and Sarah Mae Bramwell became Sarah Mae Bramwell, retaining the same name she had carried since birth because she was marrying into her own family. The price of perfection. Sarah Mae's first pregnancy arrived within months of the wedding, and Morai monitored her condition with the intense scrutiny of a scientist overseeing his most crucial experiment. He kept detailed notes about her dreams, her cravings, even her symptoms. He was convinced this child would represent the pinnacle of the family's genetic concentration. He had calculated the bloodline coefficients, studied the family's breeding patterns, and determined that this baby would carry the highest degree of Bramwell genetic material ever achieved. But when the child was born in early 1922, even Morai's scientific detachment could not shield him from the horror of what his life's work had produced. The baby, a boy named Josiah, entered the world with severe spina bifida, his nervous system so damaged and his spine completely exposed that he would never be able to control his own bodily functions. His skull was misshapen, his eyes clouded with cataracts, and his breathing was so labored that everyone in the room knew he was dying from the moment he drew his first breath. Josiah lived for 6 agonizing weeks, each day a testament to the cruelty of what the Bramwell family had done to themselves. Sarah Mae sat by his makeshift crib day and night, singing lullabies to a child who would never hear them, holding tiny hands that would never hold anything back. She had been conditioned to believe that bearing children was her sacred duty. But watching her firstborn suffer and die awakened something in her that had been buried under decades of family conditioning. For the first time in her life, Sarah Mae began to question the family's beliefs. She began to wonder if their tradition of purity was actually a curse, if their genetic concentration had transformed them into something monstrous. But her doubts came too late. She was already pregnant again, carrying another child whose genetic heritage guaranteed a life of suffering. Thomas responded to their son's death with cold acceptance, treating the baby's agony as an acceptable price for advancing the family's breeding experiment. He spoke of Josiah as genetic information, as data that would help them refine their approach for future children. When Sarah Mae recoiled from his scientific detachment, begging him to consider that they were creating lives destined for torment, he reminded her that questioning the family's ways was a betrayal of everything their ancestors had sacrificed to achieve. The second child, born in late 1922, lived only 3 days. The third, born the following year, survived for 2 months before succumbing to seizures that racked his tiny body with increasing frequency until his heart finally stopped. By 1924, Sarah Mae had given birth to 4 children, and she had buried all of them. The end of the bloodline. The end of the Bramwell bloodline arrived not with dramatic confrontation or violence, but with the quiet desperation of a woman who had finally seen too much suffering. In the winter of 1925, Sarah Mae made a decision that would have been unthinkable to any previous generation of Bramwell women. She refused to have any more children. She refused to continue the family's genetic experiment. Most shockingly of all, she began talking to outsiders about what had been occurring in the isolated Bramwell compound for nearly 80 years. Dr. Marcus Webb, a physician from the county seat who had been treating some of the family's surviving children, was the first outsider to fully grasp the scope of what the Bramwells had done to themselves. Sarah Mae's testimony, delivered in broken whispers during what she believed might be her final confession, revealed a family history that read like a catalogue of genetic horrors. Deliberate inbreeding across 4 generations had created a bloodline so damaged that normal human reproduction had become virtually impossible. But the true horror wasn't merely in the numbers, the dozens of infant deaths, the children who survived only to live lives of unimaginable suffering, the adults whose bodies and minds had been twisted by genetic damage. The true horror was in the deliberate nature of it all. This was not the consequence of ignorance or isolation. This was the calculated destruction of human lives in service of a twisted ideology that had convinced an entire family that their suffering was noble, that their genetic damage was actually evolution, and that their victims were acceptable casualties in a grand experiment. Thomas Bramwell died in 1926, found dead in the barn where he had spent his final months in increasing isolation, his body ravaged by the same genetic conditions that had killed so many of his relatives. Morai followed 2 years later, taking with him the detailed breeding records that had guided the family's destruction for 3 decades. Sarah Mae lived until 1934, but she never remarried, never had another child, and spent her remaining years trying to warn other isolated families about the true cost of genetic isolation. The Bramwell property was eventually sold for unpaid taxes. The buildings were left to decay in the Kentucky mountains, where they had housed 4 generations of deliberate human suffering. Local historians have attempted to bury the story, to pretend that families like the Bramwells were simply victims of circumstance rather than the architects of their own genetic destruction. But the truth remains, carved into cemetery stones that bear the same last names repeated generation after generation, a monument to the darkest possibilities of human choice. Today, genetic counselors use the Bramwell case as a teaching tool, a reminder of what occurs when ideology overrides basic human decency. The family story serves as proof that the most horrifying monsters are often the ones who convince themselves that their cruelty serves a higher purpose, that their victims' suffering is justified by their own twisted vision of perfection. The Bramwells didn't just destroy themselves. They destroyed the innocent children who never chose to be part of their experiment, who paid the ultimate price for their ancestors' descent into genetic madness.